Hi, everyone, and welcome to Katie Couric. 9 members of a Christian militia were recently indicted in Michigan for allegedly plotting to kill law enforcement officers. The Southern Poverty Law Center reports there were 127 active militias in the U.S. last year, up from 42 in the year 2008. Experts point to the economy, healthcare legislation, and the election of President Obama as potential factors contributing to this increase. To help us learn a bit more about these groups, we're going to talk with a militia member and later a person who has studied militia activity in this country. First, Michael Lackamar is a team leader for the Southeast Michigan Volunteer Militia. Michael, thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you.
Before we talk about your militia in particular, I'd like to ask you a little bit about this Hitari Militia that I just mentioned earlier in the introduction. What do you know about this group?
Well, the first distinction is I wouldn't necessarily label them a militia because a militia is comprised of citizens of a community. What this is it's an armed group that was ideologically and religiously driven for a specific goal that escapes my logic as to what best defines a militia. This group was driven by religion to fight for Jesus against the forces of darkness, which baffles me as to where that come from.
And so tell me a little bit about the Southeast Michigan Volunteer Militia and how it differs from the Hitari, sort of what your set of principles are.
Well, first of all, us, as most militias are open to the public. Members of the community are always invited to come to our meetings, come to our trainings, see who we are and what we do. We are a function of the community. We're here to serve the community.
Who are you, though, and what do you do? Can you just explain sort of why you decided to join this group, what you advocate, and again, what sort of your principles are?
Well, just like the community at large, our group differs widely from person to person. Myself, for instance, I got involved out of a need to be more self-reliant in case of an emergency so that I didn't have to rely on somebody else to subside. I don't have to wait for somebody to come and rescue me. I'm capable of taking care of myself and my family now until things can get back to normal. That's what the militia as a whole puts forth, is a sense of self-reliance to allow its members to take care of themselves, free up emergency responders to go where they're more urgently needed in case of an emergency, and then also to augment those responders and assist in the community.
Yeah, can you talk sort of in less abstract terms for me, Michael, to help me understand? When you say an emergency, what kind of an emergency are you talking about? And when it comes to sort of self-reliance or protecting yourself and your family from what?
Well, there's 5 areas we focus on that are included in our mission statement: crime, terrorism, tyranny, disaster, and invasion. Those 5 categories will encompass anything that really affects the American way of life. Mm-hmm. And we train in skills that would be of assistance if anything falling into one of those categories were to happen.
So,
now, some categories, such as disaster, are more common, more possible than invasion or an all-out tyranny. But we focus on all 5 because there's a lot of overlap in the preparation of those.
Well, when you say tyranny, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, the best definition of tyranny would be a government that exerts total control over its populace. Mm-hmm. And that was the reason the militia was originally put into place when the country was founded, was to resist tyranny, because you have to remember, we had just fought a war against a tyrannical government.
Do you believe that the U.S. government, that there's a danger that the U.S. government is going to take over and basically get rid of all your individual rights?
Well, what concerns me as an individual and outside of my group is that the tools necessary to enact such a tyranny, such a postponement of rights, are in place, and we're at the point now where we are trusting in our leaders to do the right thing.
And
Right now,
and you don't think that trust is well founded or well placed?
as far as with our current administration, there hasn't been anything happened yet that would erode my trust, would cancel out my trust. But if you just blindly trust in your leader, no matter who the leader is or what party he's affiliated with, then you leave yourself open to disappointment.
Do you or your group advocate war against the government or violence in any way?
Violence is never the answer. Our place is to ensure that the people have the avenue, the right to address the government for their problems.
In what way?
Well, we're here to make sure that the people have the right to demonstrate. The people have the right to speak out, because the Second Amendment was put into place to ensure that the other rights stay put.
How do you feel about African Americans, Jews, and other minorities in this country?
Like I do any other American. I don't differentiate between one or the other. I'm lucky enough that I grew up and I live in the Metro Detroit area, and we've got people from all walks of life here. We've got Middle Eastern communities that are the largest concentration of Middle Easterners outside the Middle East. We've got Hasidic Jewish communities that have been around and assisting our neighborhood and our city as a whole forever. We've got Detroit to our south. We've got the more affluent suburbs to the north. And our unit is geographically positioned in such a spot that we can really draw the best from all of them.
Do you have any minorities who participate in your militia?
I don't, if you look at us, if you're judging superficially, yeah, it's a bunch of older white guys. Myself, my heritage is I'm part Cherokee. My co-leader, one of my other team commanders, is half Filipino. We've got a communications coordinator his wife is from Asia. We've got people from all over the place. We've got a web technician who's an African American. It's just everybody kicks in and contributes where they can.
How often do you all meet? How did this group get established to begin with?
Well, this group is an offshoot of the original Michigan militia that was established years ago under Norm Olson. After a series of well-publicized bumps in the road, the group kind of fractured. A lot of them basically gave up the will to continue doing what they were doing under the intense media scrutiny we were facing at the time. And what you ended up with is you ended up with a few units that were still strong and still driven. And the Wayne County Brigade, which is what we sprouted out from, was one of those.
Do you believe in the creation of a new world order? And if so, what exactly does that mean, Michael?
The New World Order, as it's circulating amongst the conspiracy crowd, and I can tell you about some conspiracies. I see them in my email box every day. The New World Order, as it's defined there, is a one world government. They're afraid it's going to be a socialist government, one that's going to crack down on rights in exchange for power and wealth. That's the driving fear about a lot of these ultra-right groups, such as what we saw last weekend. A one world government or new world order could also be a benevolent force if it's constructed and driven the right way. If you had a complete world government under a constitution very similar to what we have in the United States, that could be a good thing. It could help the entire world. If you have an entire world under the type of regime we see in China or Venezuela, that would be not such a good thing.
You have said that your group is not extremist, but you would go to extreme measures to protect citizens. When you say extreme measures, what exactly does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Well, you have to have a certain reverence for human life. And, you know, that's the wonderful thing about being American is we've always stood up for the people that are being stepped upon, the people that are being put down. And when it comes to my family, protection of my family, there's no limit to what I would do to protect them. Beyond that, I have a love for my community, which would fall into more or less the same category. If I have a neighbor that's hurting, if I have a neighbor that needs help, I'm there. If we have outsiders trying to come into the community and trying to hurt us, trying to take our lives away, that's when the defensive aspect of the militia really springs into action.
So I'm assuming that the right to bear arms is a very critical cornerstone of your philosophy. Is that accurate?
That is the right that allows us to do what we do. Without the means of self-defense, the means being effective, modern means that would allow us to offset those that might be aligned against us, then without the means, then what we do is really ineffective.
What other sort of cornerstones are there to your specific ideology for you and other members of your group?
I would say that a large portion of the group, but not the entire group, would fall into almost your civil libertarian category, where your social rights leave the people be, let them do what they want so long as they're not harming others. And then conservative when it comes to fiscal and government, we want the government to leave us alone.
How do you feel about health care reform? I'm assuming you oppose it.
I do oppose it because I don't feel it's the government's place to control the health care in this nation. They put it forth as it's in danger, it needs help. But time and time again, whether you're talking about homelessness, whether you're talking about drug abuse or crime, we see that normally government fixes and government programs are really ineffective for dealing with the problem.
Do you feel that the government or the current administration is overstepping its constitutional authority, and if so, how?
I think the government is overstepping. The first and foremost way is on the issue of state rights. Everything that comes up now, it used to be set up that the states were the be-all, end-all, and the federal government was in place to make sure that the states played nice with each other. And now with increasing taxes, increasing revenue, increasing programs, the government is using the money that these programs generate to get the states to flex to their will. We're starting to see some of the backlash of that with the states that are filing suit against the federal government on the passage of the health care.
The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks the growth of militias in this country, has suggested that the election of a black president is contributing to the rising numbers and an increase in the people joining militias. Do you think that's true?
I don't think that that's a contributing factor at all. The Southern Poverty Law Center is in place to alarm people, and that's their focus, and that's what they do best. Because the president's African American, and that's the first thing that they can point to, then that's what they assign to everybody. I can honestly say that at all of our meetings, whether they're the public meetings or our administrative meetings, the president's race has never been discussed. It's never been brought up. It's the policies that concern the people, not the color of his skin. I thought we were supposed to all get past that.
Does it bother you that militias are inevitably characterized as extremists or downright, worse than extremists, just completely morally repugnant in terms of their level of intolerance? In your view, are there good militias and bad militias?
There are both. I mean, like any group, you're going to have good and you're going to have bad. I think the militia movement as a whole really turned a corner shortly after 9/11 when people started to realize that the biggest threat we faced wasn't necessarily our own government. Before then, you had a lot of the survivalist mentality. You had a lot of, what we saw this weekend. And 9/11, for many, many people in many different ways, was a wake-up call.
Well, Michael Lackamar, team leader of the Southeast Michigan Volunteer Militia, we appreciate your time and for explaining why you have joined this organization and for telling us, in your words, what your group stands for. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Katie. I invite you and your colleagues to come out and see us anytime you want.
Okay, thank you. Joining me now is Kenneth Stern, who's an expert on extremism and anti-Semitism from the American Jewish Committee. Ken is the author of The Force Upon the Plain, the American Militia Movement, and the Politics of Hate. Thanks for joining us. Nice to see you.
Thank you for having me.
So is this man we just heard from pretty representative of the militia movement in general or not?
Well, the militia movement is varied. You will have people that will decide to go and, in small groups, act on things with violence. You will have groups that will try to pretend in some ways that they're more mainstream, some that are more media savvy, some that are really underground. So it varies. This gentleman, in some ways, I think, is trying to paint it both ways in the sense that he's talking about doing things as civil defense groups and trying to help the community. But if you look at his website, it's interesting that they have as an emblem for their group the white rose, which is, as they explain it, that's a symbol from a group that was fighting Nazi Germany, a group that stood up to Hitler and basically got killed for it. And he says on the website that he's not, saying that we're as bad as Nazi Germany, but the parallels are there, and that's why they use that symbol. So to me, that's saying that the sort of insurgency type of what they're trying to do, they're trying to say that the government is evil, the government is fascistic, we're not going to be able to change it by the normal processes, so we have to resist it in the way that one would hope the Nazis would have been resisted.
So you say pretend. I noticed you use the word pretend to be mainstream. Is there no such thing as mainstream militias in your view?
In my view, it's very rare. I mean, you may theoretically find that, but if you look at historically, and what we're talking about is something that's been cyclical, going way back to the days of the Ku Klux Klan and the post-Civil War, you've had this sort of formation of what Richard Hofstadter called the paranoid style in American politics. You have people that have basically decided to pull together for fear of losing, a white majority, fear of losing power, and seeing themselves as the true American patriots, arming themselves to fight the government. So instead of talking about changing via elections and changing in other ways, they paint the government as demonic and try to push back on it. And as one of my colleagues, Lenny Zeskin, said a number of years ago, when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had a lot of people that easily, cut and pasted the Soviet Union as the evil empire and put the federal government as the evil empire. We saw the sort of crescendo of that with the Oklahoma City bombing, and then now it's starting to recycle again.
Right, but this individual, this gentleman basically says he's a law-abiding citizen. He doesn't believe in breaking laws. He believes in the Second Amendment of the Constitution, the right to bear arms, to protect his family. But you think there's a sort of a more malevolent undercurrent to some of these positions?
Yeah, if you read their website, they talk about constitutional laws. And if you look at the history going back, again, in the mid-'90s, there was, Terry Nichols was something called a Christian patriot. They basically said, well, we support the Constitution. When some of these folks went and testified in Capitol Hill in the 90s, so we support the Constitution, we're law-abiding citizens. But when you mine down a little bit further and say, well, what do you mean? So we believe that the first 10 amendments are ones that, are God-given. And the other ones afterwards, votes for women, freeing the slaves, and so forth, were problematic. So I don't know that this particular individual subscribes totally to that. But when I see somebody talking about, well, laws that we define as constitutional, that says to me that there's something else going on here, that they may be trying to say that it's their interpretation of the law that they're going to uphold, and other people's interpretation of the law they find frightening and worth fighting.
Let's talk about this Hitari group, which has gotten a lot of attention this week. Where does this group stand on the spectrum of militia organizations in this country? I'm assuming it is way out there.
Well, it's sort of unique in some ways, too, because while you have militia groups that have been sort of secular in the sense that they're all ideological without a religious overlay, and you have some that combine the two. As a matter of fact, the militia heyday in the 90s was inspired, in some ways pushed by groups that are Christian identity adherents. Those are people that believe that there was a failed creation, and that explains people of color, and then God created white people with Adam and Eve, and God created that Jews were actually the offspring of Eve and Satan. So there are those people that were pushing the militia movement, and there are still some of those groups around. This one doesn't seem to be Christian identity, but it seems to tie in the sort of violence against government that it's was trying to carry out, with a religious overlay that said about the end times and so forth. And whenever
and
you
wanting to kill police
wanting to kill police
and
officers,
then more
that's right.
police officers at
the
the funeral.
That's right.
So I don't understand. So they were trying to
Right.
get everyone to raise everyone up out into an anti-government frenzy or something. But how do you do that by killing police officers?
Well, if you look again back in the 90s as well, the police officers were, and other government officials were, the main targets. When I was talking about this at the heyday before Oklahoma City, it wasn't Jews and blacks who were particularly the potential targets of these groups, even though there was the white supremacist leadership and the sort of organization to it. It was the Forest Service workers, it was the postal workers, it was anybody that was associated with government. And there was a time back in the mid-90s when you had Forest Service workers that had to work in pairs for fear of so what it basically did is it created this sort of frenzy of belief that the government was evil, the government was secretly plotting to take away all your freedoms. And
anyone associated with the
anybody
government
was representing of it and was a fair target. And as a matter of fact, you were doing something positive by going after them because you were fighting this evil beast.
So obviously this Hitari group was quite dangerous.
Oh, absolutely.
Would you describe all militia organizations as dangerous?
I
mean, you might not want to generalize here.
You can't generalize because there are some that are probably all talk, and there are some that aren't. But the important thing is that they work in a sort of not only on the spectrum, but sort of as a movement. In the sense, there was a colleague of mine named Ken Toole, who had a brilliant metaphor for the militia movement back in the 90s, which is apt to what we're seeing now. He said it's a funnel moving through space. And at the wide end of the funnel, there are people being picked up by sort of mainstream issues. Back then, it was the Brady Bill and some of the environmental issues and so forth. And now we're starting to see it with health care and some other issues. So at the wide end of the funnel, people are being sucked in there. Get a little further, and you get these conspiracy theories. So there's a suppressed truth. The government's really trying to steal your freedoms. Out of the small end of the funnel, the people that give over their identity to this and said, yes, we've got to fight. We're like the new American patriots, and we're going to do it with violence.
People who are joiners, so to speak,
well,
who need to find something to believe in and some place to belong?
Well, not only that, the ones, I think that could describe people in other parts of the funnel, but the ones that say, now I have a mission in life. It's to go out and fight this battle. I'm doing it in the same tradition as Thomas Jefferson and Sam Adams. And I'm fighting the evil government. I'm going to, take my chances and hope to, to achieve the political result I'm looking for through violence.
So, are they all violent?
Not all of them are violent, but there's a system, and the more people that you have at the beginning of the funnel, the more people you're likely to have at the end of the funnel. And that's the concern for all of us that are watching this now, that saw this manifestation 15 years ago. I think law enforcement, as we saw in this case, understands the threat and has been infiltrating appropriate groups and did a very good job in this case before anything could happen. But the other thing that brings people into the lip of the funnel and makes it more likely to come out of the small end, the rhetoric, of demonization, the painting of political leaders that you disagree with as fascist or conspiring to take away, rights, and that helps people feel that this is a normative thing.
It legitimizes it.
It legitimizes it.
So that, of course, begs the question, because we've seen that kind of fervor at some of these Tea Party protests. Mm-hmm. In some ways, is this Tea Party movement, while many, I think, members probably have legitimate concerns about government overreaching and taking too big a role in our lives, but is it somehow feeding into this militia movement? Because I know that the numbers in the last year have more than tripled for militia organizations.
That's exactly right. And I think there is a correlation there. Again, I think your point is very well taken, that a lot of the people in the Tea Party movement have nothing to do with this, and they shouldn't be painted in the same brush. That being said, there are a number of people on the far-right white supremacist movement who see the Tea Party as a good place to try to organize, and a number of us are really concerned when comprehensive immigration reform hits the front burner, because that could be the fuel on the fire. If you think about it, America is going to be a majority non-white society if the projections hold true by 2050. The white supremacist crowd is very fearful of that and sees this particular type of activity of organizing of people's fears as something that they can really want to do for their building up their own membership, and they see this as an issue that they could do it with.
We saw these numbers climb during Bill Clinton's presidency, as you mentioned, 15 years ago. And I know the Southern Poverty Law Center follows these numbers very carefully, and they believe that the increase is partially fueled by not only a bad economy, which I think makes people feel very disenfranchised and disillusioned with the government or the status quo, but also the election of an African-American president.
I have great respect for Mark Potok at the Southern Poverty Law Center as a friend and a colleague on this. I disagree with him some. I think it may be a factor, but if you look historically, you know, the heyday of the Ku Klux Klan, which had similar types of agendas, back in the United States was in the 1920s, which was, you know, the roaring 20s before the Depression. And if you look at the other manifestations in the 60s and 70s and 80s with the Posse Comitatus and the Minutemen and other such groups, it didn't necessarily correlate, you know, with a bad economy and certainly without an African-American president. So it may be a factor, but I wouldn't put too much emphasis on it because we've seen this before when those factors weren't there.
Well, when there was a white president.
Right.
But you also have written that these groups believe that blacks and non-whites are not human,
Right.
and Jews are the offspring of the devil. So it seems to me a logical conclusion that racism and anti-Semitism plays a big role in this.
It plays a role.
But you don't think it's a recruiting tool?
No, I think if you look at the funnel again, once the people get sucked in, that's where the anti-Semitism plays in. Because then if you're thinking about, oh, there's a secret government that's trying to take away our rights, then who has the power to do this? Who has the power to make a world where there is a majority of non-white people in the United States by 2050? And that's where the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories come in. The people that tried and succeeded to a large extent in the 90s of setting up the structure for the birth of the militia movement were those folks who had that worldview, the Christian identity adherence. But I don't see the people that are necessarily sucked into the movement at the wide end of the funnel coming in because of that. And I think
it's hard to say, though. I mean, you can't really, you can't say for every person his or her motivations, right?
But what I'm saying is that historically what's happened is that people get sucked in by mainstream issues. The one
like
back in the 90s, it was gun control, it was environmental regulations, you know, the same sort of federal intrusiveness types of issues that you have now.
So now it's healthcare reform?
Now it's healthcare, and what we're really worried about is when immigration gets to be the front burner issue.
And what about the overall state of the economy? What kind of impact does that have on creating an atmosphere in which militias can thrive?
Historically, if there's been one study that I know of that looks at the correlation between hate group activity and a bad economy about lynchings in the South, it showed one correlation, but by and large there hasn't been much. And again, as I said, in the 1920s, at other times, we've seen the manifestation of hatred without the overlay of economic distress. It may be a catalyst, perhaps, but it's not a cause.
You say that the authorities really didn't take militias seriously until the Oklahoma City Murrah Federal Building bombing in April of 1995, which I remember well. But Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols were not part of a militia group per se. Do you think they were somehow motivated by the same ideology as militias?
Oh, there's no question about it. They both showed up at Michigan militia meetings. Terry Nichols was a Christian patriot adherent, again, one of those people that believed that the United States was, you know, divinely inspired, and the Constitution's first 10 amendments were the ones that we have to buy, but not the other ones. So they were certainly influenced by. And McVeigh was somebody who read, the Turner Diaries.
Right. What about the difference between patriot groups and militia groups? Because I think some people may not know that dichotomy. Can you explain that?
Well, yeah. As I was explaining before, you have this overlay of Christian identity, right? This belief that, you know, blacks aren't even human and Jews are satanic.
That whites are the chosen people, that Christian whites are the chosen people.
And that you could be a Christian identity adherent in Australia or Iceland or wherever. Christian patriotism is American in the belief that the U.S. is the biblical promised land to whites, and that looks at the, you know, which laws they believe are divinely inspired and the ones that they see as contravening that, you know, the 14th Amendment and so forth, are ones that they want to dispense with. Militias are basically a subset of that culture, and it's a group that believes that to one extent or another, the federal government is inherently evil, and it's their duty as American patriots to fight them, you know, with violence, as opposed to leaflets, ballots, and other things.
But is it always sort of a proactive, violent motive? Because sometimes I think as we heard, it might be, I just want to protect myself and my family. Do you buy that?
Well, if you're protecting yourself and your family, you join the neighborhood watch. You know,
Well, we have a right to bear arms, and if somebody is going to threaten us, we want to be able to use guns as we see fit.
Yeah, but this isn't for the the burglar that may be coming into your house. This is seeing the federal government as the burglar writ large.
Sort of like Randy Weaver and Ruby Ridge.
Well, yeah, Randy Weaver was a Aryan Nations adherent, and so in some ways that's true.
So when do you go from being a militia to being white supremacist, Aryan Nation, or is it all sort of?
Well, the way I look at it
because
is
the gentleman we heard from will say, "Hey, I'm part Cherokee. Someone in the group is Filipino, and it doesn't mean that we believe that white people are the be-all, end-all."
That's right. And you've had small numbers of people that are non-white in this movement, but it's overwhelmingly white. And the movers and shakers historically have been people associated with the white supremacist movement. And even though many of those leaders from the 90s are now dead or incarcerated, there's still an overlap in terms of the agenda of the white supremacist movement to organize people, to suck them in from these sort of mainstream issues. So again, you have the people. When you're talking about a militia movement, the funnel metaphor is really useful because you have people at the wide end who may not see themselves that way, but it's a system, and if you suck them into the part where they're really going to pick up guns and do things like this indictment alleges, they get to the point where they do see things in those black and white and racist terms.
The internet must be fueling membership to these organizations in a way that wasn't possible before the invention of it.
I don't know that that's absolutely true.
Really?
The internet is a great source for sharing information. I think a lot of the people in the far right believed that it was going to be a panacea for them, that it was going to be a great organizing tool. It's a mixed bag. They were able to do it beforehand through faxes and telephone calls. It does make communication and the ideological transmission easier, but you still, to do a thing like this, you need groups of people coming together and making the plots and deciding how they're going to do it.
And how do they get organized? Does somebody just sort of, do two people start it and then it just grows? How does that happen?
It could happen that a small number of people decide to pull this together. And one of the things that, if you remember the Freemen from the 90s, it was sort of post-Oklahoma City, that group in Montana that held off the federal government for a while. You had a couple of people that decided to build a compound and a structure built around this ideology, and they attracted more people to them. And those are the people I'm concerned about. We're sitting here in New York, where militia movement, nobody really is concerned unless they decide to blow up something. But you live in some of these smaller communities, and people get afraid to express their political beliefs because they have neighbors who have strong political beliefs that have threatened to kill people that don't agree with them. And that really puts a chilling effect in many small communities. And I'm concerned that we may be starting to see that happening again.
So can anything be done to diminish the level of rage or anger or alienation that is fueling these organizations across the country?
Well, I think two things, one of which I think is being done, which is law enforcement is taking them more seriously and not letting them have that type of traction that I was just talking about in communities, at least I hope. And the second thing is a level of discourse. And I think that's a responsibility of all of us, of the media, of politicians, of others, to say we can disagree. We could disagree vehemently. We could disagree strongly about political issues and so forth. But when we start demonizing and talking about secret plots to take away our liberties, and the only way to stand up against it is with violence against our neighbors, that becomes a problem. And we can't allow that type of rhetoric to go unanswered. We have had situations in the last couple of weeks where some members of Congress have been threatened, and one had a door of his office broken. If that becomes normal, you're going to see an increase in these types of groups big time.
Ken Stern, Director of Anti-Semitism and Extremism with the American Jewish Committee. Thanks so much for your insights. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Katie. It's been my pleasure.
Good to talk to you. And thanks to all of you for watching. You can see all the episodes of At Katie Couric anytime you'd like to at cbsnews.com. And now stay tuned for a message from our sponsor, Dove.